but your job, like the body of believers' job, or like when we gather as the corporate church, is to equip the saints for the work of the kingdom. So the question is, what is the metric that we use to say, like, hey, how do we know if what we're spending our money on when we come together is actually resulting in that? And I would argue
question. Baptisms.
No, and the answer is not baptisms. Ladies and gentlemen.
Whole episode on it, though. Sorry, go ahead.
All right, we'll try again. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the I'm Telling God About This podcast. So today's episode, we are talking about DOCE, or DOCE, or I don't even know how we would pronounce it, DOCE. This is the Department of Church Efficacy. And the idea is based on Doge, obviously. But what's been going on is, we've been watching the news. You guys, unless you've been living under a rock, you've completely missed out on what's going on in our federal government right now. We are moving fast and breaking things, just wholesale, ripping out departments and programs, and just going through things with a fine-tooth comb and asking the question, is this necessary? Or is this fraud? Or our favorite, is this sin? This is the real question, right? So,
well, asking the question of, like, is this in the heart of the Constitution? Is this what the original founding fathers would have seen, or would they be rolling over in their graves if they saw it? I think that's an interesting question. I think that would correlate to the Department of Church Efficacy.
So if you're here and you're listening, we would love to, we're going to dissect this. We've been talking about doing this episode for over a year now, actually. And if you're attending a church, I want you to hop into the comments, share what you have seen in your church. I run a faith-based nonprofit, so I'll be able to speak into this from a Christian nonprofit view. I also partner with a lot of them. We have seen a lot of potential waste in the Big C church, and we're really just curious about, what do you think about that? Do you think your church doesn't waste any money at all? Do you think that they're the most efficient with your kingdom dollars? I'm here for it. I'm curious what you guys think. Like, what have you seen in your churches? Because
name the church in particular, along with the specific activities that you think are waste.
Totally dime them out.
We will not name drop, except for, of course, you'll hear about our organization. But
yeah.
And ping your pastor in your comments.
Yeah, you
so he
tag
knows.
your pastor in this episode.
Yeah. If you are a pastor and you're listening, hop into the DMs, because I would love to hear from you.
Defend yourself. This is literally what, I often wonder sometimes if you guys saw the meeting that happened, I think it was yesterday, and we can probably cut it in at some point if it makes sense, but that with Elon sitting with all the cabinet secretaries and Donald Trump, he brings them in. And, we sent that email out to all of the government, and he was like, hey, look, tell me the last 10
things you did last week.
Yeah, 5 things you did last week, and basically if you don't respond to this, you're fired, right? Like the whole undercover boss narrative, I have just always asked myself this question in ministry. Whatever it is that I'm doing in terms of, like, whether or not it's a Sunday morning service or a Bible study or an event, it's like, if Jesus showed up right now, would I be ashamed? Like, that is my
yes. Just
number
to be clear,
one.
If your answer is anything other than yes, you are not properly calibrated.
You're right. That's fair.
Next
Would I
question.
be abnormally? Would I be at an elevated sense of shame? Right.
Background shame.
Yeah. Background shame.
Has.
There's a minimum threshold of shame here. If you want to know about our views on shame, you can go watch our last episode last week because it just dropped actually, so won't point to that one. But yeah, so that's the idea, right? So, those are the things that I look at is like, hey, what is going on in our churches and stuff that we look at and we're like, okay, is this necessary? Is this actually giving any kind of a return?
Well, why don't we define, like, in our own words, what the purpose of the church is.
Turn in your Bibles
So
to
that-
Ephesians
so
4.
that- let's go.
go ahead and
Fourth
pull
turn in
that
with
up.
You, like a New Testament edition.
Because I have to keep saying it all the time. All the
Yeah.
time.
I'm not saying
like-
you're wrong. I'm just saying it comes
I
up a
know.
lot.
Because, exactly.
Well,
It's like, Josh, you preach out of Ephesians a lot.
I think-
simplify it. Josh and Josh, give
Equip
us your
the
answers.
saints for the work of the kingdom, the role of the
All right,
church.
so 4:11,
Thank you.
right?
Just read it from the text.
So Christ himself gave the apostles, prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip this people for the work of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we reach unity in the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining the whole measure of the fullness of Christ.
Really?
Yeah.
NIV,
the
the,
first thing
nearly
that's-
inspired version? What? We have standards here.
Wait, hold on. Well, then let me go.
Jeez Louise.
Doulas.
I'm gonna go NASB 95. How about
No,
let's
what?
just do
Oh
King.
my God.
There we go.
Just do the
I'm
ESV,
gonna
the
go-
one that every God-fearing
yeah,
Christian
the ESV the
has
elect
in their...
standard version. All right,
Yeah.
let's go net because it has the most. All right, here we go. 11, right? Here we go. And he himself gave some as apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers to the blah, 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 blah. All right,
To the important
saints
part.
to the work of the ministry. Yeah,
Yep.
sorry. To equip the saints to the work of ministry, that is, to build up the body of Christ until we attain the unity of faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, a mature person attaining to the measure of Christ's full stature. I don't know. I think the
Okay.
NIV
Here it
was
is.
okay on that.
Hey,
Yeah,
fun
it wasn't
fact,
bad.
If you guys want to know how many KJV subscribers we used to have, it's whatever we had before.
It's 465 minus
whatever you
the
see
number
now.
is.
Yeah,
But
let's
listen,
turn to the perfect
so-
English-inspired version.
So let's look at this, right? So here's the goal of the church. So if we're saying, how do we measure whether or not a church, like what is the purpose of a church? Well, first thing we're going to do is make the distinction that all of you are going to be screaming about. There is the church, which is the body of Christ, right? All of us Christians together, we are the church. Then there is the gathering of the saints for the purpose, like our communities, when we come together, right? Now, Second Temple period, synagogues, that's where we kind of grew up out of. Our picture of church kind of grew up out of that, where in the synagogue system, the Jews would come together and they would receive teaching from, the Torah, from the Pentateuch, and then there would be discussion and there would be collective study, and through growing in knowledge and sharing of testimony and being in each other's lives, sanctification would take place, right? And sanctification, for those of you who don't know what that means, is basically our process of like becoming more like Christ on this side of heaven. How our behaviors, thoughts, deeds conform to the image of Christ, right? So to equip the saints.
Let me add on to that.
Go ahead.
Because I think it's definitely the equipping of the saint to grow in maturity, but it is also the worshiping God together, as we see in Colossians 3:16, encouraging and edifying one another in Hebrews 10:24 and 25, where he says, like, don't stop going and gathering together. This is edifying for the body.
I think those are just components, though. You're just delineating sub components of
but
the
the
higher
root,
topic. It's not
mission.
and. Yeah.
So the question
Right.
is this, Josh.
Okay,
the question
yeah.
is this:
So-
to equip the saints for the work, right? So then the question is,
Right.
what is the work?
What is the work? Exactly. And that
Right.
is-
So those are the
that
two
is
things
the
that we
work.
need to place ourselves in to determine if we are meeting it or not meeting it. Right. So are we equipping who? The saints. So this one will get you in trouble. Is church, the corporate gathering, for believers or for the lost? What's Ephesians 4 say? Right? Equip the saints for the work of the kingdom. So the work of the kingdom is to what? Great Commission. Go out into all the earth, baptizing people, so discipling the lost and bringing them to saving knowledge of Jesus, right? And to repentance. And so that's the picture, that we have a group that we're gathering together as a community to equip, and he's given people giftings within a community, right, to facilitate that. And so that's all that's given to us, right?
Right.
So doesn't tell us
So I
size.
think that's a fair definition. I think that is at the root and the foundational level. Here's what we didn't hear in that there is a building involved, or that there is a ritual involved, or that there is a order of worship involved, or that
You really
there
gonna do this
is-
now?
You know what I mean?
patriarchy.
I'm just saying. I'm just, look, here's the thing.
Not patriarchy,
Those
but
things
a,
in and of themselves may not be
Presbyterian.
bad. But
Correct.
here's the thing: form follows function, and if
Oh, where have I heard that before?
the form of the church is to be this place, right, or this building is the church, as a function, then I think it might take away from the idea of equipping the saints, because then it becomes only God's presence and the equipment can happen in this building, only or at this place, or with this order of worship. This is where I think there has been some disagreement.
Everything is
And I would
permissible.
say-
Not everything is beneficial.
right, and keep that in mind,
Michael Scott.
Because here's the thing: I would recommend, right, as much as Tim doesn't
Oh
like
my
it,
gosh,
I would recommend. Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing.
You
I
cannot
think it
say the
goes overboard.
topic is about church efficiency and then sneak in a plug for deconstructivist facts.
I'm just saying. What does not teach scripture? I'm saying that there. I think it goes a little bit.
It's basically following from the premise of, well, if it's not specifically outlined in the Bible, then that's just a pagan thing. It's like the idea that a church should not have any of its own traditions or
it's when the
cultures that are
purpose of-
downstream of Christian principles.
Sure.
And that if they have them, that it's somehow
I agree with you
pagan.
100%.
That's absurd.
No, I agree with you 100%. But that's not
right.
essentially what
Pause.
I'm saying. But
Pause.
It's about the
No, yeah. If you
the
want to
form
argue
follows
this, I will
Pause.
argue this for the rest of the episode.
All right. Pause.
Okay, but
Pause.
if you want to talk
All right.
about the
Let's-
topic that
you
you
know
said
what?
we were going to talk about,
This is the topic. Let's do this. Let's save that for the after show. Let's save it
Yes.
for the
All
after
right.
show. But
All
what
right.
I'm saying is I think form follows function, and when you have the purpose of the church being to build up and equip the saints, but then you make the actual meeting together not about equipping the saints, about something else. That's the problem, and that's where the Department of Church Efficacy, I think, needs to step in and ask the question.
Yes. And so we're
what are the
here
5 things that you're
to do
doing in
that.
church that's making you a
Yes.
better Christian, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That would be
now
my
that we've-
question. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No.
All I was going to say is now that we've established the definition, it allows us to then discuss it. And so now that we have roughly come to a common agreement, now through the lens that we've seen in the Western Church today, is it doing that? And do we feel comfortable to the extent that it is doing that? Like we're not exactly here. Let me just put this out here. We're not exactly here to just dunk on the church. Like that's not or Christian organizations. Although we might have some fun
A little bit.
playing around in that area. I would actually begin this conversation to you guys. What do you think about this? I think the number one hindrance or step that any Christian organization or any church puts in the way for this conversation is they do not adopt and commit to a posture of 100% transparency with their financials. And that, in my opinion, is a great place to begin because the church that I attend, this is a thing I've been in discussion with them about for many years now, where you are doing more than some churches, which is you're publishing your annual numbers. Hey, here's how we're using your kingdom dollars for the work of the kingdom, for the work of the church. But the way that sometimes things are bucketed, it's very blurry. It's very, and so it leaves suspicion in certain individuals' minds. And so an example would be in our ministry. I, for 9 years, have adopted a posture of 110% total transparency. If you want to see any dime and dollar that Proven has ever donated or ever given or ever spent on anything, every year I film a video and I open up our P&L and I open up our expense sheet and I film a video and release it to the whole network. If you want to know how much we pay our people...
You're reporting 10% more expenses than you actually have? Is
No.
that...
Oh, yeah, normally, because we're always in the red. So if you want to donate to our ministry, I would be happy to receive it. But
See,
what
use of free publicity. That's efficacy.
So anyway, I have always been annoyed because I've never seen anybody else do that. And as a investor, as a donor, It's me doing what I think is right and what I would want to see, which is just show me, just tell me how you're using the dollars and in what way. How much are you spending on marketing and advertising? How much are you spending on keeping the lights on? How much does it cost to keep the building, heated all winter long? Like, et cetera, ad nauseum. And I'd be curious what you guys have seen in the churches you've attended. Do you have any experience like that? Because rather than us just speaking anecdotally about how, hey, churches, you shouldn't have a big building, shame on you, like, I think it'd be fun to get maybe more into what you've actually experienced.
I feel like I've generally seen a lot more transparency than you're describing. I think, yeah, and granted, I've never been one to attend like really large churches, and so maybe that's part of it. That's not to say that every like single transaction is visible at every level, but at minimum, every single transaction is visible to a group of people that is responsible for executing that transparency. Because I think there's probably a fair argument to be made that creating the opportunity to piddle over every single individual swipe of a card is maybe unproductive, because somebody's going to take issue with something all the time. And so having a appointed, selected, but not small group of people who have that transparency, that seems fine to me. I don't know that I feel like you would have problems if you tried to expose the individual transaction level to everybody in the whole thing. So I think you'd have arguments a lot.
I don't want to pivot to this entirely yet, but I want to bring it up here because I think it's important, because I'm going to say this again. A lot of the problems that we have with the efficacy of church systems, process, and everything, they're problems of scale. Okay? So it is, and that's important because as a leader, it's one thing to say, I have a church of 300 people, and if you want to see our expenses, then by all means take a look, right? Because you're not dealing with the kinds of situations at a church of 300 that you're dealing with at a church of 12,000. And the reason I say that is, if you have a problem before a major event at a church with 12,000 people, and you have invested a substantial amount of money, you have the sunk cost fallacy, it's nothing to say, well, why did you go out and spend $6,000 on, what's it called?
Mix.
Sam's Club food, pick whatever, right? Or like, why did you run through Chick-fil-A and just buy a ton of stuff at the last minute? Couldn't we have done it this way? Well, we could have, but the caterer failed, our contract fell through, and so we ended up, you see what I'm getting at? Like, there's a level of
I think
problem.
That's great.
Yeah, I think it's good too,
see
but
the
I'm
problem.
saying, no, but my point is that it would be easier. It's also, here's another piece of the equation. At 12,000 people, right, you're not going to have good faith actors across the board, right, at the same level, because not everybody is known. No, it's not about that. It's about people who have that access, who then come in and cherry pick and paint a narrative, and then other people who are less diligent, less attentive, maybe who don't care, can get swept away, or the reputation can be tarnished. So my answer to you is this: I think transparency is the right answer. I think that you have to Tim's point, I think it's less of a big deal if you're a smaller church. If I'm a leader, it's much easier to be open and transparent with dealing with a smaller congregation, a smaller pool of interested parties, than it is to do that with 12,000 people.
Yeah,
right?
I think that you're missing one step there, though, because basically in your anecdote, you jumped in halfway through an existing situation, and you skipped over the question of whatever caused that need to, go and replace a catering thing with Chick-fil-A at the last minute. Should that have been happening in the first place?
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think there's a certain level of cynicism. I gave
an example there.
For sure. Like I have for sure that I think is,
and I've seen that. That's an example.
Well, yes, but here's the thing that I think that is a a check on ourselves, because like when it comes to the government, if the government had like full disclosure and it said here's where all of your dollars come from, and even if like I paid my taxes and all of my taxes went to one organization and one small group, and that was my contribution, and that's really all I had focus of, I guarantee you I would be critical, like, what am I paying you for if you didn't do this, or you made this mistake, or you weren't perfect? Because I'm part of the system, I'm paying into the system. And so in the same way, it's very easy to get cynical of those, even a small church. You go and you're like, well, what am I paying this pastor for if he's not able to, come visit at the hospital at this hour of the night? It's a pretty high level of cynicism where it's not a level of understanding, and understanding that when we have pastors and we have people in our church that we're paying, or we have organizations or programs, like there has to be an understanding, like these are people, these are humans, and if something is continually broken, then obviously we need to have that conversation. But when something doesn't work perfectly, it's like everybody would, like, church splits happen over the color of the carpet being changed,
so
right? Like, this is the kind of cynicism that we need to get rid of.
I don't think so. That's a 30-year-old anecdote.
Because that was a real thing 30 years ago, though.
Yeah.
Like when you're in one town and half the people don't want to spend because it's their money too, right? You do something, you're going to alienate part of your people. I mean, this gets back to our tithing episode.
Let me use a different example then. People will split their church based on they don't like the preacher and the style that he preaches.
Sure.
Rather than whether it's actually biblically sound.
But your point, to answer your question, I'm pro transparency.
What I'm saying, I think, is, and you can push back on me here, but I think that's the core of the problem, because everything else is downstream of this. And I was never saying let them go through every credit card swipe. But what I am saying... That
doesn't sound like 110% transparency, Nick.
because here's why I say it's downstream. Whether you're a church or whether you're a Christian organization, all of a sudden you're buying a fleet of church vehicles. All of a sudden you're paying for advanced church subscriptions, for discipleship curriculum and material. All of a sudden you're like, we
Top
can just
MacBook
make
Pros for
we can just make a
$1 million
list of things
to Politico.
like and why I'm saying this matters is because we almost can't have this conversation without beginning from the assumption of transparency, because then what we're saying is, well, the people can see some things, but they can't see other things. And that's where the slow creep begins. And that's how we end up with mega complexes and multi-million dollar church budgets, and which I'm not necessarily saying is always bad. But man, if you want to build, like I know a mega church, and I'm not going to say who and where, and they built a facility that can seat 50,000 people. And now, 8 years later, the max amount of people that they ever have in that facility is like 15,000. And so they're like, why did we build this building? We never should have built this building. I'll tell you why. Because they didn't have this protocol in place. And that's my point.
Go ahead, Tim. Sorry, I'll go after you.
Well, I think you guys kind of are making some assumptions about, like, should the church even be putting itself in a position to be organizing this amount of material resources in the first place?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, which is a whole different conversation, but sure.
Like there are specific charitable obligations that do run through the church, biblically. They are usually very local and very targeted, and they
Widows
draw
and orphans.
from... Sorry?
Widows and
Orphans. Yep.
Yeah, well, and there's also
there's more.
the disabled,
I just gave that.
but yes, people in need for some unavoidable reason, and so if that's that's not like a light, because we talked about this in our charity and tithing episode, like that's not like a lightweight obligation. Those are given as like, this is the heart of all true religion, right?
Absolutely.
So this is not some ancillary thing. And so when you are then engaging in all these ministries, costly ones that are competing, right, with that specific goal, you got to ask yourself, are these things we should have been doing in the first place? Like, I don't think there's any problem with having a building. And there's people who will argue that point with me. Like, I don't think there's a problem with building a building to
Sure.
house your activities.
100%.
You know, but you absolutely cross over into, you know, a level of, you know, ostentatious behavior, like what Nick was describing,
Yeah.
that is categorically similar to, oh, we just built a building with a swimming pool and with a, you know...
Yeah, I think ultimately the same thing, the same issue with government is the same with the church. How do you get a group of people organized for a specific purpose, equip them, and mobilize them? That's really what government is in a large space as well, right? We want to promote good and punish evil, right? But less the punishing evil part in the church. That's God's job. But
We can talk about it.
yeah, that'd be a whole other thing. But my point is that it's an
That'd
issue
be a
with
good
scale.
episode. Church discipline.
The same conversation that we have in government is, well, wouldn't it just be easier if we just did all this from the federal level? Look, we can pass one law and it affects everybody all across the country. And we can pull all of our resources and federal taxes and we can take all this money up to the top of the government and then we can distribute it across. And so that way communities who have less will be able to have more, and communities that can afford more can, you know, help subsidize that and pay for it, and all of these different things. But the same root problem has always been the case. The founders saw it. Everyone understands this. It's accountability. And that's, to your point, Nick, the issue is accountability. The issue is not necessarily just transparency. The issue is accountability and the ability to influence. And when I say accountability, what I mean is it's not just that you can see the problem. It's that you specific individual, have agency to act against it. Right? Or that as a small community or as a group of people that you have the ability to affect change in that group that you're a part of. And in the church, towards the ends of the goals of what you're trying to, you know, accomplish, it's the same with states. It's like you want to push the power and the resources to as low a level as possible for a lot of reasons. One, because complexity obfuscates. It makes it harder to see clearly. When you have 12,000 line items in your budget for the year, that takes a substantial amount of time, energy, and understanding to really paint a picture of what's happening. If you have 250, that's manageable. And then, oh, by the way, if you can convince a third of your church or a quarter of your church that there's a problem, well, now you have the ability to basically shut that joker down if there's an issue. You know, at a church of 12,000 people, it takes a lot to mobilize a portion of that organization to actually pressure or create change if that's necessary. Now, so that's what I'm trying to say. I think there is a direct parallel here to what's going on in government, and that's a fundamental understanding for most people of what is the best way to consolidate and mobilize resources and people towards that end. And most people haven't really thought, hey, I mean, I think people know this intuitively. It's easier with a smaller group. And so, yeah, you know, my opinion is that, yeah, transparency and accountability is a problem, but the real problem is scale. The real problem
I think
is...
you're largely right, but there is also a feedback cycle that I think you're missing, which is that how did you get to 12,000 people?
Exactly.
You probably did it by being pretty inefficient and allocate in terms of the work of the true work of the church.
Yeah.
And so you poured a lot of money into things that would attract a large number of people that was not really all that convincingly related to your actual core mission. And so it's not like
seeker-sensitive church, the seeker movement. That's what happened. So if we want to know how we got here as a church, it was the 90s. Like we get back to Ephesians. What is the work of the gospel? Right. Equip the saints, right? Not the lost. When you
what
make
book is that in?
Yeah, Ephesians, right? Yeah, not the fourth turning. Common. But do you see my
point? I think
point?
that actually plays into
Yes.
And I think that plays into
Tim.
the idea of the practice of the church. What are the practices of the church that are not efficient? And even though it's really weird to think, well, we have 2,000 to 15,000 people coming on any given Sunday or throughout the week, therefore it must be efficient. Well, to what Josh's point is, are those people being equipped? And so I think that we are seeing, if we go back to like the early church, we go back to like the people that were devoted to the apostles' teaching, and you look at 1 Corinthians 14 about the kind of the what they did and how the spontaneity of it all, and we can get into that maybe in the after show about all that. But what I'm saying is the efficacy of the practice. What we started seeing early on in the church is the adoption of certain cultural practices, almost having like syncretism into Christianity. And there are some things in that where you can say, okay, well, that's not like a big deal. You take for instance the Celtic cross versus the Christian cross, right? But when you start going on things like the early church didn't have like things that were sacred. They didn't have sacred relics, and they prayed for the dead. They didn't pray to the dead. This was a later function. It was or like building shrines over saints or over the apostles, and what you see in Israel today. And I think when I got to go to Israel, that was one of the biggest things that hit me. And it's frustrating to see, because you hear people, when I went to Israel, and talk about
when I went to the Holy Land,
YouTube sphere, there's like I had the most religious experience, right? But when I went to Israel, all I saw were churches built over every monument. There was a church on the rock that Jesus cried out to God on. There was a church over the rock that Jesus was laid on. There was a church over, the tomb of Jesus. There was a church over, and it was like all of these things that were built on it, and it took away from the equipping of the saints for the edification of the body, and it became this mystical thing that, to the extent where, you take you have like a Roman coin that you can buy for $150. You lay it on the rock in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you leave it there for 18 seconds, not 19, but 18 seconds, and then it becomes a holy relic. Like, these are the things where I'm talking about, like, practice. Like, how have we gotten here?
Well, because I've never been personally, and maybe there's some research on it, but because you're familiar, like, with Messiah complexes, like people go and they have this, belief that they've been now suddenly chosen to reconcile or whatever. Do gingers experience that at the same rate as other Westerners?
I do. Yes. I was waiting for it, man. I was waiting for it. No.
Okay.
I just feel like we overcomplicate things, and there's church split over these things, and we argue from the same poisoned well without actually going back to the Bible.
So let's go back to
the point that's part of the building is responsible for that or something. And I just
we can go into that in the after show. I'm not saying that is specifically the reason. Okay. I'm saying that contributes to it in the form follows function.
Here's the issue, right? It's this. Everything is permissible, not everything is beneficial, right? You cannot say it's good or that it's good from an organization. Like, this is the difference between individual and organizational leadership, right? And we talked about this in the last episode too. Even our other episodes when we talked about government, there are things that are different when you try to apply the individual standard to like a king or a government. They have a different set of responsibilities, a different focus. They have different constraints, and this is what you have to look at when the difference between being someone who's making disciples, someone who is discipling somebody else, a group of friends gathering just to worship and do that, versus when you are leading people, you're discipling disciple makers, right? Like, if you think about it, if you had the apostles, disciple makers, making disciples of just regular people, but you had Jesus, disciple of disciple makers. Like, he's teaching people who believe how to then make disciples. This is an organizational leadership problem. And so when you're asking, if I have a mission where, like, let's use Jerry Falwell, right? Jerry Falwell says, I'm going to go back to my hometown.
Senior.
Senior,
Jerry
yes.
Falwell
Jerry Falwell Senior. Very specific, very important distinction. Jerry Senior, when he founded Thomas Road Baptist Church, he said, hey, I'm going to go back to my hometown, and I'm going to start a church in my hometown. And his hometown, contrary to what a lot of people think, like not everywhere in the South was, had a church on every corner all the time, right? So I'm not saying Lynchburg was necessarily like that, but Jerry went and he knocked on basically 100 doors a day, right, to get people to come and connect, right? Now, I leave the scaling problem aside for a second. He then did some things that were pretty revolutionary back at the time, right? He started bringing in like television, because back in that time period, not everybody could get into a community. It was a lot more like here in Europe, where things were a lot more spread out. People lived in farmland. They weren't coming into town all of the time necessarily. You know, he started busing people in. Like these were deliberate decisions that resulted in getting families plugged into a community. And then that, you know, that yielded, you know, growth. But our goal is not, as Christians, is not just to get growth. And you brought this up, Tim, is that you can do things that will bring people in and introduce them to the gospel. But your job, like the body of believers' job, or like when we gather as the corporate church, is to equip the saints for the work of the kingdom. So the question is, what is the metric that we use to say, like, hey, how do we know if what we're spending our money on when we come together is actually resulting in that? And I would argue
baptisms.
No, and the answer is not baptisms. I would argue that the answer to that question
Told you that
is
in confidence.
Yeah. How many people have actually in your congregation are actively discipling somebody? And so, like, and I draw that line. I mean, now this is not an explicitly biblical concept, so I'm not going to say like this is prescriptive in this nature of like how we're making this decision. But when we look at least for me personally as a pastor, when I'm talking to somebody, my question is pretty simple. Like, if someone comes to me and says like, oh, I want to be involved in church, like I feel God's calling me into ministry, and I ask the question, who are you discipling right now? How many people have you discipled? What has your experience been with discipleship? Are you like, do you do that? And notice I'm not saying evangelize. I'm not saying how many people are you out just proclaiming the gospel to. I'm talking about like deliberate engagement with individuals. That's the metric that I would use to say, is my church healthy? If I could walk out before I preach and I could walk over to a group of people and I could be like, so tell me about this week. Who are you discipling? What's going on? Have you like, I should have people coming up to me going like, hey, when I was talking with this person and they had this question and I don't understand what that is, or they asked this thing, like that's what
the indicator, I think.
It's
when people are asking you for asking questions about things that they are,
or even if they're not asking. But I mean, I think
disciples.
that would be very healthy. I mean, I have seen that, but like it's a question of like, if I just ask that simple question, like, are you actively in the process of deliberately helping somebody go from no understanding of Jesus to transformative understanding and repentance? And if the answer to that question is they're just working on themselves, then you're not like.
And what I'm saying is and I think that's absolutely right, Josh. And I think that one of the indicators that you are discipling somebody is that they are initiating the conversation with you about things regarding the Bible, about evangelism, about the gospel, about apologetics, about whatever, and they're coming to you as opposed to somebody else. That's a sign that, hey, well, maybe I am discipling.
So what
person,
are those programs?
Right?
That's what I'm asking. What have you guys seen? And I can tell myself, but I've been talking a lot already. But like, tell me what you guys have seen. Like, what things do you think are effective in churches? And I'm not going to get into the size thing right now, but just like, I don't really care, big or small. Like, what have you seen that actually results in that?
I'll be real quick. I think the most effective thing that I have seen in churches is the Bible study group or the small group within a small group of people where you go
have the worst opinions.
Where you go through like a book of the Bible and it's open discussion where people are actually growing and learning. So go ahead, Tim. Tell me how effective your discipleship is.
Real quick.
Hold on, let it go.
To chime in, that is the current Western church answer. Like that is the thing that they're pushing small groups as is the
that going
like
well?
Hey, well, I would say no, but it is interesting that, and I'm not singling you out, Anderson, but like that is the answer of like we prioritize small groups, and I think we need a better metric for discipleship.
I agree. Go ahead, Tim. Did you have something?
What are the other ideas? What are you guys thinking?
I was just going to throw like kind of a peace offering to the larger churches, because there are things that you can do. at scale, and it doesn't have to be huge, but for example, like we go to a church that provides we have young children. We go to a church that provides childcare during the service. That means a lot to my wife and I, that we can go and be there, because if you're trying to have young children in a traditional church service, you're basically one of or both of you is going to spend a lot of that energy.
And that was the hardship in our house church is children. Yeah, when children started coming, that was hard.
Is wrangling them, and so there are certain things that at scale, and there's a rotating team of people who are providing that, but because there's enough people and those ratios are what they are, it's the kind of thing that can be done, and that you wouldn't otherwise be able to, and so. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, well, are you discipling, blah, blah, blah. There are ancillary activities that you engage in that make things more approachable for people, even if it's not the act itself of discipleship.
Oh,
so
I agree.
Think you have to back off a little bit. Yeah.
No, I think they're both true. I don't think it's a back off thing. I think I can absolutely maintain that standard and say that what you're saying is true. And I also would say this.
Trying to pick a fight.
No, I'm dead. And also I'm going to tell you this. If you are in children's ministry, you're discipling. Because those little sinners aren't saved yet, okay? And they need Jesus. All right? And if you spent time with anyone under the age of 6, you know what I'm talking about. So I completely agree. And I think that's, if there is one thing that I think is tremendously valuable about having a collective organization, and to be honest, it's usually the first thing, and we experience that in a house church, that really becomes a scale issue, is the issue of child care. It's if you're equipping the saints, and the saints that you live in the vicinity of are families, then that's a multi-generational problem set. So now all of a sudden things get complex.
You see that in the way churches self-organize. You generally have churches that tend to have a heavier proportion of young families congregating together, and then you'll go to others where it's just a sea of gray hairs and whatnot.
Yeah, that's true as well.
And I would argue. Well, I'm curious because it's almost as if from my personal vantage point, we start well, but then we can't get the baton across the finish line as the Big C Church in the West, where it's I think we would all agree at scale this structure needs childcare, and we're saying this problem of all of these families together, that in it of itself can be viewed through the lens of discipleship. If you have a robust, youth and children's kind of curriculum, yes, childcare too, but my kids are learning Bible verses and come back from the childcare with, hey, I learned this thing about Moses or whatever. And just for context, I grew up in a Presbyterian church where it's you sat there in the pew and you were quiet while the pastor preached, and anyway, so I've seen both lenses, but then so you get childcare down, step one. And you get solid preaching down, step one. You get childcare down, step two. And then it's okay, so now what? And then it's oh, well, we have really good worship and our attendance is growing.
No, see, this is where I think, this is why I think it comes back to scale, because you hit it, right? You wanted bottom-down transparency. I want top-down transparency also.
Yep.
And this is the fundamental issue. Is that once you get past, and again, I go to the, we talk about Dunbar's number here, but the maximum amount of people that you can maintain solid relationships with, it's the same structure.
Add Dunbar's number to my Josh Hughes bingo card.
Hey, you should. But it's right because it's right.
Ephesians 4, Dunbar's number.
I have to keep saying the same things over and over again because nobody learns.
AI,
but my point is this. Dunbar's numbers gets at 150 something people, and the reason that's important, it's the same amount of people we use in a platoon in the military. Anytime where the mission is necessary to have accountability up and down, we don't go beyond that number. And so, to your point, if part of the reason the house church worked was because there was accountability in both directions. We said, hey, we're committed to this. And so if someone didn't show up, it wasn't you were ghosting your best friends. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're not ghosting those families.
Right.
Like, that's what the issue is. So I would really argue that unless you have a very solid group of elders in that community, elder families, and I don't mean that in the official church structure standard elders, but I mean, like, if you don't have proven entities, proven families that are making disciples that help drive and know people for maybe who aren't that developed in your congregation, who aren't in there inserting themselves into the lives of those other people to ask where they're at and what's going on, you will never have it. You'll never see what I'm talking about. And if you talk to anyone, if I any one of you guys, if I asked you what the point in which, like, you grew in your faith the most, it wasn't in the vacuum without somebody placing an expectation or bringing to you the light of Scripture to show you what is expected of you, and someone who would express disappointment if you lived contrary to that, someone who you cared about. And that's, I have yet, in my experience in ministry or as a child growing up in ministry, I have yet to see a large church, for the sake of, and I will be incredibly generous here when I say large, over 300 people church. I have yet to see a church over that size that is doing this. Like,
Well, and maybe we can argue that in the after show, but I think what I'm hearing you say, though, like, I think if we're going to, like, the idea of
top down,
accountability,
that's the answer.
So, but to go on to the actual, like, the Doge aspect of the church, that the idea that go into a church, find out what is good, what is working, and then the corruption and the evil that is also happening in it. I look at that this occurred, I would say, in the Reformation. The biggest change, the biggest difference that Martin Luther brought to Protestantism, that was a change from Catholicism, is he brought the Bible to the common man, to the layman. He brought the preaching. He brought the understanding. He brought the context to the person to read for themselves. And so, what I'm hearing you say, though, Josh, is that's not enough. Like, that there needs to be, it needs to go further. It needs to be there an accountability. And so maybe the next phase, or if there was another kind of reformation, it would be eliminate these over 300 member churches, and maybe stay away from the argument of the scale, but eliminate the structures in place. And I'm not talking about buildings, Tim, but eliminate the institutions in place that limit the amount of accountability and community that builds up the saints through the,
Look, here, you want the pass? Here's the deal. You can have a church as big as you want, as long as you have real Christians in the right ratio. That's it. So, so here's the deal. Like, more Christians, grown-up Christians, mature Christians, gathering together, and you can have as big a church as you want. But it's just a simple matter of management. Like, if you've got 10, privates, you got to have one sergeant, and you got to have, for every 5 sergeants, you got to have one staff sergeant. Like, you got to have people who are further down the road who are pouring into those individuals. And I'm not saying this in a formalized structure. It's just simple. One person can only be known, or can only invest so much time into so many people. So if you've got 15 rock star Christians, and each one of those Christians can realistically, and keep this in mind, Jesus had 12. None of us are Jesus. If you've ever tried to actively disciple a number of people, I'll be honest with you, I would struggle to handle 6.
Okay, well, I mean, one of them turned out to be Judas, so, like...
Hey, man, everyone has to make their own decision, but he was led right. I mean, that's right. So, but my point is that. So, like, do the math, right? Like, that's what I'm saying. Is so I guess the real answer is, like, Department of Government Efficiency is largely based on the engagement of believers. So if you're hearing this and you go to a church, like, I don't care if you're called to, again, this is where we can talk about a whole other thing about, like, professional ministry versus just being a disciple. Like, look, if you've been walking with Jesus for an extended period of time, and you have made disciples and you've done that, well, congratulations. Like, welcome to varsity. Like, you're in the game. Like, you're needed, especially if you go to one of these big churches. That church's health is dependent on you being active in the lives of the people who are there. So, yeah, because you just can't. Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting you say that, because it had me thinking of this idea where, what if a church, and this is fictional, only because I don't think I've ever seen it in my 37 years of existence. What if, like, the resources were leveraged in such a way where there was like a 70-30 relationship, and it was like, okay, we have this 70%, and this is designed for discipleship, for sharpening, for deepening, for growing. Like, I will say, you can walk into a church and they can have a good organization and they can have small groups, but I've never seen like emphasis placed on the small group as the vehicle they're utilizing for the training and equipping of the saints, and like kind of like playing the field as if that's their A play and that's where they're putting their resources. I don't know. I just think that would look really cool.
Hey, you hit the nail on the head, because this is the problem. If you've ever been a small group leader before, go into a small group and say, hey, I'm here to help develop you and to grow you. And if you want to be a part of this, this is a two-way street, right? This is an active discipleship role. My job is to help you make disciples, which means that you have to give me permission and the openness and the vulnerability for me to ask you what you're doing and where you're struggling and how I can help you, right? Do you know how well that would go over in most churches in the U.S.?
Right.
Like,
well, I think that's the other part of this conversation, is that when you do start emphasizing in that direction, you lose a lot of the things.
Let them go.
Well,
let them go. Let them go. You want to see your church change? Bet. Do what I just said in your small group. Let them walk away. The ones that stay, double down. Double your time.
Small groups structures also have a very weak concept of leadership in the first place.
Yes.
They tend to be sort of like,
facilitator,
open discussion, but and that's not biblical either. Like there's a clear hierarchy. There is a teacher, there are disciples, and these kinds of things. And that's part of the reason that I think most of the manifestations of small groups have been really weak, is because it gets mired in its own lack of organization, because you just have a lot of opinions of people who shouldn't be trying to disciple the rest of the group proactively at that point.
Yeah.
And its lack of organization is because it's a lack of priority placed on it by the church.
See, I actually disagree with you on that. I have seen churches go really hard on the small group thing. Like, basically, they consider that the basic building block.
What does going really hard mean to you?
So they make it as the basic building block of their entire church. Basically, everything has to either originate from or flow into a small group structure at some point. But the individual structure of those small groups still had that weakness of, we're just like committees of
that's the
equals?
problem. No, that's exactly the problem. They're too afraid as a pastor to tell Joe Schmo in my, so you want to be a small group leader, right? Like, first of all, this is part of the issue, is that they say, hey, come get connected. Do you have interest in your small group? And these churches are so desperate for anyone to show the slightest semblance of a desire to disciple people and grow, that they will just say, congratulations, like, you have picked on the first category of qualification for the office of elder or deacon. You desire the office, and that's important. So we're gonna engage you, and we're gonna empower you, and we're gonna train you. But hey, here's the thing: don't make anyone mad. Don't say anything deliberate. You're not the boss of these people, and you can't hold their feet to the fire. morally.
Right.
The moment you do that, you'll have some
They're on their
Karen
road to
going to the
sanctification,
senior
and
pastor.
it's
Exactly.
not your job to sanctify
right.
them.
You're not the pastor here, my guy. And so because they don't do, that's to your point, is exactly the issue. They go hard, they say it, and they're absolutely right. If they did that, it would work. But they're not training and equipping the leadership
Yep.
of those small groups and
That's
telling
quite
them who they are. It's just like in the families. It's the same problem we have in families. When we go to church and you hear on Sunday morning, hey, guys, you're just, the marriage family teams, husbands love your wives, Christ love the church, and, wives submit to your husbands. But, it doesn't mean like rule over you or that they have the authority.
Buddy.
Yeah, I know. But when they do, it's like the whole thing. Nobody says, hey, guy, you're the boss and you're responsible and you're accountable. And hey, spouse, if you're doing something that your husband has a problem with and he tells you like to stop and to knock it off and you disregard that, that's sin. Like that's real. But we won't even talk about it in the context of a family where it's cut and dry, black and white.
Because
Yeah,
we become
yeah, yeah.
allergic
People
to
immediately
hierarchy.
jump to the
Exactly.
fringe pieces
And that's
of
rebellion
abuse.
and witchcraft. That's not my words. That's the Bible.
Let's go.
So what
I don't know why they're laughing, Hughes. I'm here with you.
I know you're with me. So here's my point. Like, you can't make everyone happy, but when your metric is numbers, that's what you care about. I'm not afraid of people not showing up to church. I don't care. Also, because it's federally funded. Shout out taxpayers.
a little bit there.
Yeah. And Doge can't come after me because I have a federal mandate I have a mandate from Title 10 in the U.S. Constitution for free
You have a
exercise.
mandate from
so
heaven, sir.
I do. That
That's
also.
right.
That also. But my point is,
Doge proof.
if people, and this is again why the scale becomes an issue, if you require that money to pay your salary, and that money is dependent on how many people attend, and your small group leaders are out there scaring off the weak and the unengaged, then that's cutting into your bottom line, and it becomes really easy for you to be like, guys, we got to preserve the platform. I mean, if these small group leaders are out here running amok, scaring away all of the congregants, and then how will we continue this great ministry we have over here with the elderly, or this great ministry that we have over here with, these other things? So anyway,
No,
so that's
literally perfect. And so, like, truly, if you're here, I want to hear in the comments from you. Like, have you seen this? How would you don't have to rate your church, but I would love to hear
Rate your church.
5-point scale.
Your take on this conversation. Because here's the point. We did a really good job of going to Scripture, defining the church, the work of the church, and then, like, it wasn't a tangent. The reason we talked about resources and transparency is because we got to the point where we're like, okay, we need to be emphasizing discipleship because that's the point. And so it dovetails perfectly because you should expect your church to have accountability and transparency, and it's okay for you to ask for those things for the purpose of working together as a body, pursuing the Lord, wanting to prioritize discipleship and the equipping of the saints. And so I liked it. I think it all flowed perfectly. So this has been an amazing episode of the I'm Telling God About This podcast. Like, subscribe, and share this. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you guys again soon.
comment Ephesians 4 for a free heart. Click.
We're giving out hearts.
We're giving away hearts
Leave a
and
comment.
likes. Thumbs up.
Civilization, all you have 20 years of dumpster fires, purple hair, people who don't know which bathroom to go into. Get off my lawn.